The Myth Traveler, Prelude, Bookstore, by Jonathan Thomas Jones. Read by Jonathan Thomas Jones. He walked slowly through the old bookstore, rubbing his fingers against the spines of the books in the various sections on the way to his favorite area. Harvey's Bookshelf was the name of this place, and there was no place he had ever preferred spending his time. It was the only bookstore in his part of the city, and it wasn't corrupted by the corporate commercialism that plagued the bigger places. Just as that thought moved through his mind, he reached the area he was looking for. Sci-fi fantasy mythology was on the sign above the section that hadn't been updated in what seemed like years. It was okay to him, though. He didn't care about the new books anyway. The older stories were always more appealing to him. He browsed for several minutes, but it seemed much shorter to him, because he loved the process so much. He had been coming here since he was a small boy. He picked up a book, World Myth and Folklore. His mission was complete. He could feel it in the binding. He smiled widely as he walked to the checkout counter. "Ah, Francis!" the owner called as he saw the young man approach. He was old enough to be Francis' grandfather, but still had a youthful sparkle behind his glasses. He was frightfully skinny and tall, but there was no hunch in his back. His hair was gray, but still streaked with black. "I hear your birthday just passed." Francis nodded.
"Yes, Mr. Harvey. I made 19 Saturday."
"Well, whatever book you choose this week, my boy, you can check out free of charge."
"Thank you so much,"
Francis answered excitedly. He hugged the book close to his chest and began to walk toward the exit.
"I'll bring it back next week."
"I know you will," Mr. Harvey responded. He chuckled as he watched the eager young college student practically fly toward the door. The young man was like a nephew to him. He had been visited by the boy every week for 10 years. It was nice to see him grown, happy, and in the land of higher education. He was just happy he could still contribute. Before Francis could reach the door, someone rushed in and knocked him down. "Hey!" he called in protest as he started climbing to his feet. Another man came in and kicked him in the face, knocking him back down. He rolled his tongue around and felt the inside of his cheek was split. He spit up blood and started trying to rise. He felt really lightheaded, though, and found it difficult to move. He looked up to see that another man had come in, and the first one was pointing a gun at Mr. Harvey. The man was yelling at him. Francis had to shake the cotton from his head to make the world stop spinning. The man looked past Francis as he heard the bell on the door jingle again. "Man, lock the door," the man commanded. Francis looked back up to see a woman, dressed like some kind of hood but still beautiful, lock the door and close the shutters. It was late anyway, approaching closing hours. People didn't come into Harvey's Bookshelf often, especially this late. People avoided walking in this neighborhood at night. Francis had just really wanted a book. He looked up and saw the man with the gun slap Mr. Harvey. "This is what happens when you don't pay up, old man." One of the other thugs began dumping gasoline on the bookshelf. "No!" Francis protested. He started getting up only to get kicked again, and this time by the woman. She kneeled over him, pulled him up by a shirt collar, and punched him in the face. A small explosion went off behind his eyes at the impact.
"You'll shut up if you want to keep that pretty face of yours intact," she said to him, slapping him solidly before dropping his head back down on the hard wooden floor. He felt really lightheaded again. He could hear the other thugs in the room laughing at him wildly. He could hear the man with the gun yelling at the top of his lungs. It was distant to him, but he could make out something about not paying to be taken care of. Apparently this was some kind of racketeering or extortion or whatever, he deduced. Francis had heard of this type of thing happening before, but had never really paid attention to the stories. Gang activity was commonplace in this area, so it had never been a big deal to him. Until now, of course. He came out of his thoughts as he felt them picking him up, taking his sling bag and roughly binding his hands behind him with some kind of twist ties or something. "Wrong place, wrong time, kid," the thug behind him apologized, or at least it sounded like an apology, because the man shoved him hard toward the back of the store. He struggled and the girl hit him in the face with his own book. He spat out a tooth. "Let the boy go," Mr. Harvey demanded. The man with the gun pistol whipped him. The old man fell to the ground unceremoniously. He was yanked up to his feet. "You don't tell us what to do, old man," the man with the gun proclaimed. "We're just going to take what's in the register in the safe and then burn down your store. If you help us, we might just let you be outside of it." Mr. Harvey paused and thought for a second, then swatted the gun from the thug's hand and hit him with a heavy volume that knocked him to the floor. Francis struggled and got hit with the huge World Myth and Folklore again. Mr. Harvey threw the book at one of the hoods that was pouring gasoline, knocking the jug from his hand and splashing the liquid about. Before the store owner could reach the gun, the thug who had previously held it kicked it across the floor. It skidded to a stop at the feet of the one who dropped the gasoline,
and he quickly grabbed it. Francis began to fight wildly despite his bindings, and it took the woman and the other thug to hold him and try to keep him still. Mr. Harvey punched the thug and ran for the phone. He quickly dialed 911. "They are robbing and vandalizing!" He was cut off by a shot to the chest. The old man coughed up blood and fell to the floor in a heap, leaving the phone dangling from the wall. Francis screamed. He was fighting so hard he hadn't even realized what the gunshot meant for his old friend. He didn't even notice that the firing of the gun had caused the gasoline-splattered thug to catch fire. All he noticed was the fact that they weren't holding him as strongly, so he fought harder. They weren't holding him as strongly because they had noticed their flaming comrade running around and setting everything he touched ablaze. The fires were quick to spread over the old and dried books and the wooden floors and shelves that had been doused in gasoline. They let him go and ran. Francis sat up. Everything felt so surreal to him, the same way dreams felt, but he was terrified nonetheless. The hungry fire quickly devoured everything he had fallen in love with over the past 10 years. He heard its crackle and a harsh laughter, mocking his very existence as it rushed toward his precious sci-fi fantasy mythology section. He forced himself to stand just as the thugs ran out of the door. The college student, unfortunately, could not remember the first rule of being in a burning building. The most important thing he was supposed to do, even if he was already on fire: get out. His sense of friendship had overridden that logic immediately, and he ran over to where he had last seen Mr. Harvey. He saw his friend lying on the floor bleeding, and began looking around for something to cut his hands free with. After a few seconds, which seemed more like hours to the frantic young man, he found a pair of scissors, and after a few more agonizing seconds, he freed himself. He knew logically that, despite his open eyes, Mr. Harvey was dead, but he picked him up anyway, refusing to let the greedy fire take anything else. He stood up and took a fortunate step forward, narrowly escaping a falling piece of ceiling. He coughed as he breathed in smoke with deep, panicked breaths, not realizing that the haze growing around his vision was asphyxiation taking its toll. His shoes began to feel as if they were filled with cement, and his arms were shaking. Before he knew it, he had dropped Mr. Harvey without even noticing. With just one more step further, he himself had fallen to the ground. He coughed violently and tried to catch up to his fleeing consciousness. The last thing he heard was the sound of approaching sirens. The last thing he saw was a familiar book lying a few feet from him. He felt the sensation of water falling on his face like rain, and it caused him to stir. The sprinklers, he thought. The building must have an automatic sprinkler system. He strained to open his eyes. They stung from the effort, so he left them closed as he put his hands on the ground to help himself up. The ground was soft. It felt like mud. Then he touched his fingers to the sides of his face and realized it too was covered in mud. How could he be in mud? Had he been rescued? He struggled again to open his eyes. The left opened without too much pain this time, but after a quick inspection he discovered that the right was swollen shut. Great, he thought. One eye that's too blurry to see anything from, and another that won't even open. At least he was alive, he thought, as he felt the rest of his bruised and swollen featured face. He called out, trying to get whatever help he could, but no one would respond, so he just stumbled along. He tried to feel his way around with his hands, and whatever he could make out through his blurred vision. He tripped over something and fell back into the mud. After feeling around on the ground, he discovered the culprit. It felt like a book. He shrugged and picked it up, placing it in his sling bag, which was somehow hanging from his shoulder again, then continued to move along. He was indeed outdoors, having felt trees while walking, and having heard soft rustle of wet grass beneath his feet. Had someone pulled him from the burning Harvey's bookshelf only to leave him in the park? Hadn't he heard sirens? Shouldn't they have taken him to the hospital? He looked up as he walked and allowed water to fall into his dry left eye, cleaning his face and somewhat clearing his vision. It made him feel better until he tripped over a root or something and fell into another puddle of mud. He cursed silently and got up. Then he remembered something. He was carrying a bottle of water in his sling bag. He reached in and took out the book, placing it on the ground as he reached for the water bottle that was wrapped in aluminum foil to keep it cool. His mother had always done that for him, giving it to him while frozen so that it could be ice cold when the time came to drink it. It was melted in room temperature now, though, which he barely noticed because he was so excited to have it in the first place. He drank half of the bottle and poured the rest over his face, rubbing his eye to clean it and make sure the moisture got in. He could see better now. Where the hell was he? This was certainly not the park. There were no lights, and the park had to be well lit at all times. He didn't even see any of the many statues that were all over the place. This was more like an actual forest. He had never seen a place anything like this, except in movies maybe. Horror movies. Now that he was afraid, he decided he should keep moving. It would be better to move along and find some shelter, at least until it stopped raining. He looked at the water bottle, which was still about a quarter full, and replaced it in his pack. Then he noticed the strangest thing of all as he looked to the side. Nothing else mattered as he took note of the weird scene laid out before him. There, lying contentedly, completely untouched by the thick mud and heavy rain, was world myth and folklore. Francis somehow knew this book was the source of his latest predicament. You have just listened to Myth Traveler, Prelude, Bookstore. Written by Jonathan Thomas Jones. Read by Jonathan Thomas Jones.